I think you know our featured guest today is Natasha Trethewey, native Mississippian, now teaching at Northwestern University. She's written 5 books of poetry, including Thrall, her most recent book, Monument, and Native Guard, which was the winner of the 2007 Pulitzer Prize, and was the book that we discussed not very long ago in our Crossroads discussion group, which was conducted by Barbara Phillips and Susan Glisson. I noticed, Barbara, that you're here today, so thanks for dropping in. In 2012, Natasha became the 19th Poet Laureate of the United States. I think that's a 2-year gig. She's the author of a nonfiction book, a previous nonfiction book, and she has now given us another that we'll hear about today, Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir. It's published by Echo Press, and if you order from Square Books, you should be able to get a signed copy. We just found out moments ago that the book is on the bestseller list. So congratulations, Natasha. Our host today is Ralph Eubanks, presently teaching in both the English Department and Southern Studies Department at the University of Mississippi. He is a former publishing director at the Library of Congress, as well as the former editor of the Venerable Distinguished Virginia Quarterly Review, also a Mississippi native. Ralph is a graduate of the University of Mississippi. He's the author of 2 excellent books, memoirs, Ever is a Long Time and The House at the End of the Road. I'm grateful to those books for several reasons, but mostly because they brought Ralph to Square Books. I'm given to understand that he has something new in the works, a book called A Place Like Mississippi, coming in March of 2021, something else to be excited about, 2021 about. And that is going to feature work on landscape, literature, and history. Just one bit of information at the end: if you submit a question to Natasha and Ralph, please use the chat function on Zoom to privately message Square Books. Questions submitted to, quote, everyone will be deleted, okay? And just quickly, some of our upcoming events next week on Monday: happy hour with Roselle Lim and Vanessa Yu's Magical Paris Tea Shop. On Tuesday, a Crossroads book discussion group. And for those of you who don't know, we started the Crossroads discussion after the murder of George Floyd and the events of this past spring. And these book discussions use a book to deliberately focus on matters regarding Black Lives Matter, race, white supremacy, and what have you. The book on Tuesday will be How to Be an Anti-Racist, and will be hosted by E.J. Edney and Ruth Odell. I'm going to jump forward for a month to our next Crossroad because I'm very excited about it. 2 more native Mississippians, Eddie Glaude and Kiese Lehman, will be on talking about Eddie Glaude's book on James Baldwin, and that should be great. On Thursday of next week, and finally, Ashley Bryant Phillips will be in conversation with Mary Miller for her book, her first book, a book of short stories called Sleepovers. It's the book that's next on my reading list, and it's recently mentioned in the New Yorker in a What We're Reading section. So that's all good stuff coming up. I believe I'm good to go. Ralph, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha because Natasha, before I start with some questions, Natasha is going to read a bit from Memorial Drive. So, Natasha?
Good.
All right. So this is from the prologue. Nearly 30 years after my mother's death, I went back for the first time to the place she was murdered. I'd not been there since the year I turned 19, when I had to clean out her apartment, disposing of everything I could not or would not carry with me. All the furniture and household items, her clothing, her large collection of records. I kept only a few of her books, a heavy belt made of bullets, and a single plant she had loved, a Dieffenbachia. Throughout my childhood, it had been my responsibility to tend it every week, dusting and misting the upper leaves and snipping the browned lower ones. Be careful when you handle it, my mother warned. A small precaution, seemingly unnecessary, but there is a toxin in the sap of the Dieffenbachia. It oozes from the leaves and the stems where they are cut. Dumb cane, the plant is called, because it can cause a temporary inability to speak. Struck dumb, we say, when fear or shock or astonishment renders us mute. Dumb grief, when the grief is not expressed in uttered words. I could not then grasp the inherent metaphor of the plant, my relationship with my mother, what it would mean that she had made its care my duty while warning me of its danger. When I left Atlanta, vowing never to return, I took with me what I had cultivated all those years, mute avoidance of my past, silence and willed amnesia buried deep in me like a root. Nor could I have anticipated then that anything would ever draw me back to that city, to a geography that held at every turn a reminder of a past I was determined to forget, even as I tried to honor her memory in every way I knew how. Indeed, going back for work after accepting a university faculty position, I thought I could circumvent my former life, going out of my way to avoid at least the one place I could not bear to see, until I had to. To get there, I had to drive past landmarks that took me back to 1985, the county courthouse where the trials were held, the train station from which my mother traveled downtown to work, the DeKalb County Police Station at the intersection of Highway 285, the bypass loop around Metro Atlanta, and make my way down Memorial Drive, a major east-west artery once named Fair Street. It originates in the middle of the city, Memorial, and winds east from downtown, ending at Stone Mountain, the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy. A lasting metaphor for the white mind of the South, Stone Mountain rises out of the ground like the head of a submerged giant, the nostalgic dream of Southern heroism and gallantry emblazoned on its brow. In bas-relief, the enormous figures of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Not far from its base is the apartment we lived in that last year, at the 5400 block of Memorial, number 18D. Though I knew exactly where it was, knew the landmarks leading up to it, I drove right past it first and had to double back to enter the tree-lined front gate. From there, I could see Stone Mountain in the distance, suddenly visible where Memorial crests, as if to remind me what is remembered here and what is not.
It's just so beautiful, evocative of a place and memory. And I just really love that. As I was telling before we started, this reading Memorial Drive, which I've done twice, has really led me back in reading your poetry back into Monument. And thinking about this, I thought about the poem Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. And you go through, shall we say, a variety of responses that people have given to you when you tell them your mother's story. But it's the last line of the poem that really captures what I think you've conveyed in Memorial Drive. It's a quote from this Korean poet who said, "One does not bury one's mother's body in the ground, but in the chest. You carry her corpse on your back." Now, I know talking about this is really difficult, but has writing this book and talking about your mother's death eased the weight of that burden on your back and inside your chest?
That's a great question, Ralph. You know, when he said that to me, this old saying that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest, or like you carry her corpse on your back. So the idea that there were two ways to deal with it. Either you bury it in the chest or you carry it on your back. And, he was pointing to me as the person who has carried the corpse. And I thought about that for a long time. And two things occur to me after having finished this book. One, that indeed I have buried the images of my living mother in my chest. She's planted there like a seed that grows and grows constantly. But I still do carry her corpse on my back, and it's a burden I never want to put down. It reminds me of this wonderful poem by Jack Gilbert called Machiko Dead, in which he describes the grief of Machiko, who was his wife. And he describes it like carrying a box. And you carry the box out front of you like this until you get too tired, and then you have to put the box up on one shoulder. And you can carry it like that for a while. And then when that shoulder gets too tired, you put it over here. And then finally, when that shoulder's tired, you can actually hold it out like this again and never, ever have to put it down.
That's really wonderful. I mean, thinking about this book, and it's a book I think I said I've read twice. I realized that writing this, in some ways, you're having to relive a traumatic episode in your life. But it also, again, made me think about one of the things that you often quote in your lectures on poetry, and you sometimes quote Shelley, said, "Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted." Mm-hmm. And writing Memorial Drive, was this a means for making this part of your past maybe a little less distorted? Not beautiful, but less distorted.
I think so. I think beautiful in the way that art is. I mean, when I read those lines from Shelley, I think also of poetry as the record of the best and happiest times and the happiest and best minds. That's something else that he wrote that I think of all the time. I do think that as horrible as something may seem, the artistry of it can make it beautiful. And I think that a great example of that would be Lucille Clifton's poem about James Byrd. The title escapes me, maybe you can remember, but I mean, she's describing a poem about a man who was recently lynched in Texas. And the first line is, "I am a man's head hunched in the road." But it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was really taken by is you seem to take great care in deciding what your chapter titles were. And the first chapter of Memorial Drive is called Another Country. And it's, mirrors James Baldwin. I couldn't help but think about that novel of Black alienation of the same name. So Baldwin's other country is Greenwich Village, and yours is Mississippi. And these could not be two more different places, but you feel secure in that another country. Whereas I think Baldwin only felt this isolation. What was it about this period in your life that made it feel like another country?
Well, it was certainly another country from the place that we ended up when we left Mississippi for Atlanta in 1972. There's also something about the way that seemed to be another time and place as well, so distinct that even as I felt that security and safety in that small enclave, there was the other country of the rest of Mississippi that was surrounding us at a very difficult time, which, it's where I begin to talk about that first sense of dislocation when we leave the enclave of North Gulfport, Mississippi, where all of my ancestors are, and venture outside of the bounds of that community, where we start to be harassed and stared at by white people for whom we are still an aberration.
Yeah, I tell you in that section that the person that I really would like to know, is your aunt sugar? I just love that line that she says, someone calls her auntie, she says, and now exactly when did my brother marry your mother? I thought that is such a great.
She was very tough. And that really sums her up perfectly.
Yeah. Now, for a lot of your ekphrasis is a part of your poetry, and I like that you begin this book through an exploration of the last photograph of your mother. And you write, hindsight makes me see the portrait differently now. What is it that you see differently in that photograph now?
Yeah, I think when I first saw it, and looked closely at it after her death, it was just elegant and regal in the way that my mother was. And my grandmother sent me out to a frame shop that actually could mount or blow up the image and mount it on a kind of canvas that looked like it had been painted. So we actually turned it into a very large painting that hung over my bed in the room I describe in the book. Looking at it all these years later when I wrote the book, and maybe it's also all these years after being someone who has studied images so closely as a poet, the first thing I noticed was a little punctum. It was that little square. And if you could see yourself right now, the light switch behind you is making a very similar square behind your head that the flaw in the picture made in hers. You see it, yeah. And so I didn't notice that until I went back looking with the intention of finding evidence of what was to come. I've always had this idea that if you go back and really look closely at a photograph, you can read the future in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there are other ways you use photography in crafting the narrative that you did.
Yeah, I use a lot of photographs, and many of them, you mentioned going back to Monument, my new and selected. Many of them are photographs that I wrote about in poems before. There's the family portrait that we made in 1969 when my grandmother wanted to sort of commemorate our family and called a photographer there to take it. That's the photograph that I've written about it twice, actually. I wrote about it in Domestic Work in a poem called Family Portrait. I'm really reflecting on both, what we're doing that day, but also that image of phantom ache because he was a double amputee, the photographer. I wrote about it again in Thrall because when I looked at it again, I noticed how my mother was touching my shoulder like this. Probably to, and I say in the poem in that book, to still me, to make me behave for the camera. But looking at it is also a way of seeing how she was leaving her imprint on me.
I'm just thinking about this in terms of kind of craft. I think all narrative writing, especially memoir, you have to pull from the raw material of your life and tell a story that's going to shape a reader's experience and perhaps deliver some wisdom. Part of the story, as I see it, is not just your mother's murder, but your own transformation. In this narrative, we see a changing sense of self from the 19-year-old girl who walks into your mother's apartment to the woman who's here today. Were there books or memoirs that kind of guided you through the time you spent writing this book?
Yeah, there were so many that I loved for different reasons. I'll start by mentioning Gregory Orr, because Greg Orr is a poet. Greg Orr's The Blessing, which is a memoir, but also his book Poetry as Survival. There are moments that he talks about sort of the trauma and then the leap one might make to lyric poetry or a stop along the way to memoir. I kind of went the other way around. But I also loved Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. And the funny thing about that is the first time I read it, I wasn't ready for it. And then when I went back to it, I just read it again and again because, I realized what a magical thinker, I've been since I was a child. I love both of the memoirs of Kim Barnes, In the Wilderness and Hungry for the World. I loved Lucy Greeley's Autobiography of a Face. I could go on, there were just,
Yeah.
there are so many, Michael Gilmore's Shot in the Heart.
Oh yeah, that's a really beautiful book.
It is. It's kind of a book I wish I could have written, because it also delves so much into the history of Mormon history and the history of executions in the United States, as well as family history. I mean, he brings all those things together.
Yeah, thinking about that idea of kind of saying that a photograph is kind of a way to see into the future. I know this is a short chapter, but I was really taken by the chapter called Clairvoyance, in which you talk about your visit with a psychic.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you expressed a great deal of skepticism of the psychic, but was visiting a psychic a way for you to share an experience that your mother had? I know she visited a psychic a few weeks before death, even with your suspicion of psychics, hoping to make a connection and find something.
Well, what I told myself was, I'm the writer doing research. I'm going to go and do this because I know she did it, to have this kind of experience and perhaps like a journalist, write about it, write about going through the whole experience. I didn't admit to myself how hopeful I was, how I would have loved to have been convinced.
Yeah.
And, in the chapter, you see me going back and forth toward, oh, maybe I can be convinced. And then, oh, no, I can't. And it's the warring of the magical thinking brain and the rational mind.
Yeah, it's a very philosophical chapter. It's like all of a sudden it's like you're totally rational. Then all of a sudden you kind of go into this and you feel that tug as a reader, and as a reader you're there hoping. As I was reading, saying, I hope there's a sign.
Yeah,
and that's why I was so captivated by that chapter. I want to talk about 2005, and when you meet the assistant DA who was in charge of the case, your mother's murder. And I know this is well before you decided to write this memoir, but how did that chance meeting affect your decision to write this book?
well, even when I had that wonderful chance encounter, I didn't walk away from it thinking, now I have the documentary evidence to write this memoir. Because you're right, I had no intention of doing it even then. And I didn't read the file even then. I couldn't bring myself to look at it yet. The decision to write this came much later, in 2012. And it had everything to do with me feeling that the more known I became as a writer, the more erased my mother was being. Because it was easy for people to make an assumption that I'm a writer because my father was, as if what made me a writer came directly through him, or that I was Athena sprung from Zeus's head, fully formed. And that was problematic for a lot of reasons, because my father was also my white parent. And he was also my male parent. So it became very easy for people to say white, poet, man, father. Therefore, the daughter inherits all of that from him. And it really felt like growing up in Mississippi and Georgia, when white people would say to me, whenever I had success at anything, "Oh, that's your white side," as if nothing of value came from my mother's side of the family, that I couldn't learn about language and image and sound and musicality from there. So that hurt me a lot. It also hurt me a lot that I could be introduced when I read from Native Guard, and the introducer would say, well, this book is about three things. It's about Natasha growing up Black and biracial in the Deep South. It's about these Black Union soldiers who fought in the Civil War and were stationed off the coast of her hometown, and her mother's murder. And Native Guard is not about my mother's murder in any way. It is certainly filled with elegies to my mother, try my own contention with my own grief, but not murder. And murder is one of those words that when you stick that out in the air, I have to walk, the long distance from my seat to the podium in a room with people who are both pitying and feeling a kind of prurient interest. And my mother has been mentioned only as this victim, this afterthought of a murdered woman. I decided that I needed to be the one to tell her story and to place her in my life in her proper context as the very reason that I am a writer. Not just her death when I was 19, but everything she did up until that point to help me maintain my selfhood.
Yeah, I mean, that part of the book is really took me, as Dwight Garner said in the New York Times, said that second part of the book is like the wall of a hurricane after the eye calmly passes over, is the destructor. And he also compared Memorial Drive to Mailer's Executioner Song. I would add that it's better because it's not, there is a sense of real engagement rather than Mailer's usual detachment that's a part of his work. And I was crying through reading this part of the book, but it was not just because of what happened, but you give the reader a profound connection with your mother and her very reasoned approach and her pain. Was this like almost, I see a connection between this and the clairvoyance. It's like you're really trying to connect with your spirit. Was that part of this for you? It's connecting with that spirit.
I mean, it was a hard decision to put those in there, but in trying to structure them, you've made exactly the connection, because you end the chapter Clairvoyance with this idea that she had, no last words for me. And then immediately you get her last words. And those were the words found in her briefcase the morning that she was killed. And it was what she was writing herself to either give a speech, or I don't even know what it was for, but those were actually her last words. And I want to give you those last words after my attempt to get them from the psychic that I don't get. And so, each chapter sort of ends with something forward looking to the next chapter. That section, the second half of the book too, I wanted to show her vibrantly alive, and so that the reader would see her, she's dead the whole time, and yet there are these moments where she's alive and then she's not again. And part of that for me really hangs on the quote I use from Orson Welles: if you want a happy ending, it depends on where you stop telling your story. I mean, if we had stopped at the moment she decides to get a plate and get some dinner. That's a very different story.
Yeah. Has writing Memorial Drive maybe, I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but has it really changed the nature of the grief you feel? Has it altered the nature of that grief? Maybe that's a better way to say that.
Well, having to go back and remember so much that I tried to forget does make things a lot more on the surface. I mean, if I was someone who thought about my mother a handful of times a day, now I think about her probably a handful of times an hour. But also, I don't feel like I carry this alone.
Yeah. No, I feel that grief with you. I think everyone who reads this feels that.
Thank you.
And I think that's the great gift of this book. It makes us confront that idea of grief, because so often for us, grief is fear. And we have to all face our fears sometimes. So
Yeah.
I want to close my questions by talking about the title of the book, Memorial Drive. And memory and that street really form a through line in this book. So as you read in the first part you read, Memorial Drive's not far from Stone Mountain. It's a symbol of the Confederacy that you describe as a monument to white supremacy that joins in my psyche the geography and history of my deepest wounds. You were born on Confederate Memorial Day.
Mm-hmm.
Has the tumbling of Confederate monuments and this reckoning with the past eased that other deep wound that you carry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it eases it in the same way. We're sharing it. That's a national trauma, and it is our national grief. That it's coming down says that these things coming down, and for example, the flag changing in Mississippi says that more Mississippians, white and Black, feel that national wound and know that some kind of healing might be possible if we reckon with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go to the first question, which comes from Beth Ann Finley. And she says, can you talk a bit about the writing of Memorial Drive versus the writing of Beyond Katrina? I don't mean subject matter. I'd like to discuss prose style. Have your sentences changed, your reflective capacity?
I don't think so. I mean, it felt very much to me like the way I wrote Beyond Katrina, which still felt like a non-linear narrative, the way I wanted to return to certain motifs. The difference is, I think one of them is nonfiction and the other is a memoir. I see Katrina as, that book is trying much more to engage with scholarship and to engage with the history of the gaming industry and the history of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. My family story is part of it, and certainly a meditation on my own complicity in memory and forgetting are also there. But this deeply personal memoir calls for, I suppose, it's obvious that I'm the writer that wrote both of them. I think that would be evident to anyone reading them. Just like I would think that it might be evident that I'm the writer that wrote Monument as well as Memorial Drive, because I was writing them at the same time. Sometimes things come out in poems, sometimes they come out in prose, Sometimes the prose has a different rhythm. The rhythm is about serving the story.
The second question here from Susan Cushman. She said, I was fascinated with the brilliant way you changed chapter 6 from first person to second person. Did you organically start that way or change it later?
I started that way. And then I thought, oh, can I do this? And then I started trying to write it in first person. And then I knew why I had started in second person and why that was necessary. Both in terms of a structural thing for the book, to show that kind of fragmentation of the self that I begin by showing in the prologue when I am watching my 19-year-old self walk into the apartment on a video made by the police. Already the self is being divided in that scene. And so when you get to that chapter, then you get to see a moment that really begins that kind of what would have been a fragmenting of the self, if not for the chapter that follows it and the diary and writing that allows me to rejoin and to have a kind of dominion over the self. Also, there was the very real emotional difficulty of going back into that past I wanted to forget. I still want to distance myself from that girl. I still want to be a person to whom none of that happened. And yet I can't.
So third question from Riley Morse. Was there a sentence you wrote in this memoir that made you stop, push back from what you did, and feel that something big had happened to you? And what was it, if there was one?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a hard one. You know. Look at you. Even now, you think you can distance yourself from that girl you were, right in the second person, as if you weren't the one to whom any of this happened. I knew I had told myself the truth then.
Yeah. I felt there was a lot of that where you're just really trying to get at the truth of who that person was. That sense of growth.
And who I am right now, even.
Who you are. It's this, you see this transformation. Now, we have a final question, and it is from Karen Spears Zacharias. Hi, Karen. Karen wants to know, do you still have your mother's plant?
No, I carried it with me all throughout graduate school. I mean, years. And I think I finally managed to not keep it alive. Actually, I did. I blamed myself for not keeping it alive. But I think someone finally told me that even plants have a life expectancy, that they don't live forever. I think I carried it about to the end of its life. Maybe I didn't have it when I moved to Massachusetts from Virginia. I think I still had it before I went to Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, but a plant is a very, very personal thing. I mean, it's we have a tree that we've had our entire marriage, nearly 32 years, and my wife has taken pieces of it and rooted it to give to the children so that this plant lives on. Yeah. They're very important things, and but I also know it's hard keeping these pieces of your life. You always want to keep a piece of your past, but it's hard to keep it.
Right.
So I want to thank everyone for all of your questions. They're great questions. I want to thank you, Natasha, for writing such a beautiful book. And again, congratulations on reaching the bestseller list. It's so deserved. And I think there's a place in the chat where you can order a signed copy of the book. So please do order one. And again, thank you so much, Natasha. This has been a real delight. I wish it were in person.
Yeah, me too.
But that will be soon, I hope.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Ralph. This has been wonderful. So good to see you.
Thank you. And thank everyone for tuning in and watching. And please buy Memorial Drive, read it, tell all your friends to read it too. It's a life-changing book, Natasha. It really is. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.